The courtyard was overflowing with restless bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, a sea of anxious faces illuminated by the harsh light of torches mounted on stone pillars, and in the center stood a young woman whose name the people dared not whisper aloud, because to speak of her was to risk punishment from the soldiers who lined the square with their spears angled like teeth around prey, and she herself stood barefoot upon the cold slab of marble with her hair unbound and her garments torn deliberately by the guard so that she would appear less than noble, less than human, and though her face remained calm there was no denying that her dignity had been stripped from her in the most public of ways, because every eye, from the poorest beggar to the wealthiest merchant, was fixed upon her humiliation, and every mouth remained shut in terror of the iron-voiced general who towered upon the steps above her, his black armor glinting with authority, his hand resting casually upon the hilt of a blade that had ended countless lives without hesitation, and he laughed at her silence as though it were proof that she was weak, a broken remnant of a fallen house, yet deep inside her chest something steadier than fear was beginning to burn, though none could see it yet. The general's words cut through the air with cruelty sharpened by years of unquestioned dominance. He spoke of how her family had been erased, how her father had been dragged through these very streets, how her mother's name had been stricken from the records, how she, the last remnant of a disgraced line, would now be displayed before the people to remind them that no one could defy him and escape dishonor, and the crowd listened in petrified silence, not because they agreed but because their lives depended on it, for the soldiers watched every flinch, every twitch, every furtive glance of pity that might betray sympathy toward the girl, and already there were stories whispered in shadows of neighbors dragged away for a glance too soft, a sigh too heavy. The girl felt the weight of eyes, the weight of history, the weight of shame pressing upon her shoulders like iron chains, but still she did not bow her head, and the general, noticing her defiance, descended one step, then another, his boots ringing against the stone, and with every step he seemed to grow larger, his shadow spreading across the marble floor until it seemed to swallow her completely, and he reached out suddenly, seizing her chin with calloused fingers, tilting her face toward the crowd so all could see the defiance still lingering in her eyes, and he spat words that mocked her silence, demanding she kneel, demanding she beg, demanding she confess that her family's legacy was dust beneath his boots. But no sound escaped her lips, no cry, no plea, only the steady fire of something ancient held back like a tide behind a wall. A murmur rippled through the gathered citizens, quickly stifled when soldiers slammed spear butts to the ground, but the sound had been real. It was the first crack in the silence of the night, and the general's brows narrowed, for he knew that silence was his ally, and any sound other than fear threatened his control, so he pressed harder, his grip cruel against her jaw, forcing her head lower, until her knees buckled and she fell against the cold marble, her palms scraping as she caught herself, and in that moment the crowd gasped, for they saw dignity stolen in front of their eyes, the proud daughter of a fallen house brought low in public disgrace, her body trembling not with weakness but with the effort of restraining what surged inside her, and as her torn sleeve slipped down her arm, something faint and glimmering caught the torchlight, something etched into her skin not by ink but by fire long ago, a mark that had been hidden from the world for years, and though most in the crowd did not recognize it, the general's eyes fell upon it and his hand recoiled as if burned, for upon her arm blazed the faint outline of an emblem older than his rank, older than his power, a sigil tied to oaths sworn in blood by his ancestors, a symbol that bound him in ways he had spent his life trying to forget, and in that instant the tremor in his voice betrayed him, his booming cruelty faltering as the recognition sank in, and though the crowd had not yet understood, though they still believed they were watching a girl humiliated before their eyes, a new current had begun to move through the night air, invisible but undeniable, the turning of power, the shiver that ran down the spine of a man who had never known fear until the past he could not kill rose before him in the form of the one he thought broken, the one he thought defeated, the one whose hidden emblem now threatened to unravel the very authority he had built upon blood and fire. The general's fingers trembled before he quickly curled them into a fist to disguise the sudden weakness that had betrayed him, and though his jaw remained tight, his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease that the sharpest of onlookers might have noticed if they were brave enough to raise their gaze, for what he had seen upon her arm was not a mere ornament, not the kind of trinket peasants inked upon their skin in foolish attempts at rebellion, but an emblem burned into the flesh by ancient rites that predated his authority, a symbol known only to those whose families had once sworn oaths of loyalty so binding that to break them meant curses upon bloodlines and madness upon minds. And in that moment he felt the phantom echo of his forefathers whispering in the marrow of his bones, a reminder that his power was not absolute, that somewhere in the tangled past of this land lay roots deeper than his own grasp. The crowd, though still ignorant of the emblem's full meaning, sensed the change in atmosphere as if a storm cloud had slid across the moon, dimming the general's fire and filling the air with a tense uncertainty, and they leaned closer to one another, eyes darting, lips pressed tight, hearts daring to hope though their bodies refused to show it. The girl, still on her knees, lifted her chin slowly, her hair falling back from her face, and the torchlight revealed the glimmer upon her arm more clearly now, not just a flicker but a steady glow, as though the emblem itself had awakened, answering her silence with its own voice, a language of fire etched into flesh, and the general stepped back, a single step that echoed louder than his earlier descent, a retreat so small yet thunderous in its meaning, because never had he been seen to yield even the width of a shadow, and though his lips twisted into a snarl, his eyes betrayed the war raging behind them, fear strangling arrogance, memory suffocating cruelty. He barked for the soldiers to seize her, his voice rawer than usual, his command sharper, but when two men stepped forward and reached for her arms, the emblem flared brighter, not with flames that could burn flesh but with a light that seared the eyes, a light that struck the soldiers with hesitation, their hands faltering, their spears wavering, because though they had been trained to obey without question, something primal within them recoiled from that symbol, as though their ancestors too had left warnings deep in their blood to never touch what was sacred. The girl rose slowly to her feet, her dignity no longer measured by garments or posture but by the unshakable fire in her gaze, and though her voice had remained silent through every humiliation, now she allowed a single word to escape, not shouted, not forced, but spoken with such steady resonance that it carried farther than the general's roars, a name, a word older than his banners, older than his throne, a word that had once bound men like him to kneel before her bloodline, and though many in the crowd did not understand the tongue, the meaning pressed upon their hearts like thunder rolling across the earth. The general's knees threatened to buckle, and he clenched his jaw so tightly that blood filled his mouth, for he would not kneel, not before her, not before a remnant of a family he thought buried, yet the emblem pulsed again, and the curse of his ancestors coiled through his veins like fire, a tremor spreading from his chest to his arms, forcing his grip upon his sword to loosen, forcing his heart to remember that no blade, no army, no decree could sever oaths sealed in blood centuries before. Murmurs rose louder now in the crowd, the first stirrings of courage blooming in hearts long frozen by fear, because they saw what he tried desperately to hide, they saw his hand trembling, they saw sweat bead upon his forehead despite the cold night air, they saw the girl unbowed, and though they did not yet know the fullness of her power, they knew this. The man who had ruled them by fear was afraid, and in that simple truth lay the beginning of something greater than rebellion, the awakening of hope. The girl did not move toward him, did not reach for him, did not lift a hand to strike, for she knew that the emblem upon her arm was strike enough, its light a weapon older and stronger than steel, and she only needed to stand, only needed to endure, and the world itself would tilt, for the general's mask was cracking, his laughter gone, his cruelty faltering, his authority trembling, and all of it undone not by armies or conspiracies but by the emblem he could not erase, the emblem he could not deny, the emblem that had waited, hidden, for this moment to rise. The general's rage boiled beneath his armor as he fought against the tremor in his limbs, his pride screaming louder than the whispers of his ancestors, for to show weakness in front of his soldiers, in front of the people, was to invite ruin, and so with a snarl that split the tense silence he drew his sword in a flash of steel meant to blind and terrify, the blade catching the torchlight and throwing it across the courtyard. Like lightning, yet even as he brandished it high, the emblem's glow pulsed again in rhythm with the girl's heartbeat, and a strange vibration hummed in the air as though the stone itself remembered the oaths that bound him, and the general's grip wavered though he forced his muscles to obey, raising the weapon above her head in the gesture of execution, a gesture meant to remind all that he still held the power of life and death, but the people who once bowed their heads now stared unblinking, unable to tear their eyes away from the mark on her arm, unable to forget the way he had flinched when it appeared, and they felt something stir in their chests that had long been buried, something they had almost forgotten existed, defiance. The girl stood unmoving, her eyes lifted not to his sword but to his face, and in that calm defiance was a strength greater than any weapon, for she seemed to see through his armor, through his fury, into the brittle fear he tried to bury, and the general hated her for it, hated her with a venom that tasted of his own weakness, and so he roared, a sound meant to drown out his own terror, and swung the sword downward in a brutal arc meant to sever not just her life but the memory of her line. Yet before steel could meet flesh the emblem's light flared so fiercely that the courtyard was drowned in it, shadows fled, torches paled, and all who watched shielded their eyes as though the sun itself had descended among them, and the sword froze mid-swing, halted not by her hand but by the weight of an ancient command that his body could not disobey, no matter how desperately his will raged against it. His knees buckled then, striking the stone with a crack that echoed through the square, and the silence that followed was unlike the silence of fear that had suffocated the people before. It was the silence of awe, of breath stolen, of hearts thundering with the realization that they had just witnessed the impossible. The general kneeling. He bellowed in fury, straining to rise, but the more he fought the more the emblem burned brighter upon her skin, and the more his body betrayed him, trembling, bowing lower, until his forehead nearly touched the cold marble, and the people gasped, some covering their mouths, some daring to smile in disbelief, and in that single moment the entire order of the world shifted, because the man who had made them cower for years was now brought to his knees before the girl he had tried to break. She did not smile, she did not gloat, she simply stood in silence, her dignity no longer stolen but restored in a way no humiliation could touch, for her strength was not of vanity but of legacy, of bloodlines that had endured beyond ruin, of promises etched into the very fabric of power itself. The soldiers nearest to her wavered, their spears no longer steady, their eyes darting between their master groveling against the stone and the girl who stood unarmed yet untouchable, and though none dared move, the cracks in their obedience spread like fractures through glass, fragile but irreversible, and the people felt it too, their fear loosening, their spines straightening, their breaths coming heavier not with terror but with the tentative taste of freedom, and they knew, though none said it aloud, that the general's grip on them had been broken, that no matter what followed, he would never again command their fear as he once had. Still he roared, spitting curses, his voice ragged with desperation, calling her a witch, a deceiver, a ghost of a dead line, but even as his words thundered through the square, they carried no weight, for his body betrayed him, still kneeling, still trembling, still shackled by the emblem he could not deny, and the people looked not at him but at her, their eyes slowly shifting, their loyalty inching toward the one who had stood unbowed, who had endured disgrace without surrender, and who now stood as the living proof that the world they thought unchangeable could, indeed, be turned upside down in a single night. The people began to murmur louder now, no longer hushed whispers of fear but voices that quivered on the edge of something dangerous, something alive, and though none had yet dared to raise a hand or a weapon, their eyes spoke with a fire the general had never permitted them, eyes that flicked from the trembling sword in his hand to the glowing emblem on her arm, and the more they saw the imbalance of power, the more courage seeped back into their veins like blood returning to frozen limbs, for courage is a contagion, and it spreads faster than fear once the first spark has been lit, and the spark was there now, undeniable, bright as the emblem itself, which pulsed steadily as though it breathed in rhythm with the crowd's awakening hearts. The general, still forced upon his knees by the weight of the oath he could not break, growled through clenched teeth, spittle striking the marble as he tried to hurl threats at them, promising death to any who defied him, promising fire upon their homes, chains upon their children, but the words rang hollow, his voice cracking where once it had rolled like thunder, and the people heard it too, the fracture of authority, the stutter in his dominance, and they knew instinctively that the man kneeling before them could not burn the world because he could not even rise from the stone. The girl, standing tall though barefoot and torn, turned her head slowly to take in the crowd, her gaze calm yet piercing, and the silence that followed her simple glance was heavier than any speech, for in that look the people felt seen not as cattle to be herded but as souls bound together by a moment greater than themselves, and in her eyes they saw the promise that dignity once stolen could be restored, that what was lost could be claimed again, and when her lips parted the courtyard held its breath, every ear straining to catch words they sensed would change everything. She spoke of truth long buried, of houses and banners that had sworn fealty before greed corrupted them, of the emblem as a seal forged by bloodlines who once protected rather than enslaved, and though many did not understand the full depth of her lineage, they understood the tone, the certainty, the power woven into every syllable, and it was enough, for power does not require understanding, only belief, and belief was already igniting across the square like wildfire leaping from branch to branch. The soldiers at the edge shifted uneasily, their training warring with the primal knowledge that their general's command was crumbling, and a few dared to lower their weapons ever so slightly, not yet rebellion but no longer unquestioning obedience, and that tiny hesitation spread like cracks through stone, small at first but unstoppable once begun, for an army does not stand on steel alone but on faith in its leader, and faith in a kneeling man is faith already broken. The general howled again, forcing his body to rise with sheer willpower, veins bulging, sweat streaming down his face, and for a moment he lifted himself an inch, perhaps two, enough that hope flickered in his eyes, but the emblem blazed brighter with her steady calm, and he was slammed back down against the marble, his blade clattering uselessly beside him, and the sound of it striking stone was a signal louder than any trumpet, A declaration to all present that the weapon of their oppressor was nothing before the truth she carried in her blood, and the crowd gasped not in fear but in awe, their voices rising now without restraint, no longer whispers but cries, shouts, words of faith in her and curses against him, the chains of silence broken at last. She did not raise her arms to quiet them, did not demand their allegiance, she simply stood, her emblem shining enough to answer all doubts, and the more they looked upon her the more they felt the stirring of loyalty, not born of fear but of choice, and that choice was a power the general could never reclaim, for once people taste the freedom of their own voices they can never again be silenced by threat. The square shook with their cries, and the soldiers nearest to the girl lowered their spears fully, their eyes avoiding the general who sputtered with rage and humiliation, and though not all had yet chosen, enough had faltered that the tide was clear, the tide he had thought eternal, the tide of fear now turning against him, and he saw it too, saw it in their eyes, in the way their backs straightened, in the way their breaths came louder, in the way they no longer looked at him as master but as man, weak, trembling, defeated, and for the first time in his reign he tasted despair, and it was bitter, for he understood that power was slipping through his fingers faster than sand, and no amount of cruelty could claw it back from the people once they had seen him kneel, once they had seen the emblem blaze, once they had seen the daughter of a fallen house rise unbroken before them. The roar of the people grew wilder now, rolling across the courtyard like the tide of a storm, a sound that had not been heard in the city for generations, and it rattled against the stone walls and echoed through the towers where banners of tyranny had hung unquestioned for years, and in that thunderous chorus the general felt his empire tremble, for he knew the sound of revolt when he heard it, and this was no longer fear but fury awakened, and yet still he tried to fight, clawing at the marble as though sheer will could lift him from the grip of the emblem, his face contorted with hatred, veins bulging, spitting words so drenched in venom that flecks of blood sprayed from his lips. But the people did not recoil as they once had, they did not bow, they shouted louder, their voices overlapping in chants that named her as something more than victim, something more than remnant, chants that named her rightful, chants that crowned her with loyalty he could no longer command, and though she did not ask for it, though her silence still lingered heavier than speeches, the emblem spoke for her. Every pulse across her arm answering the cries of the people with a light that grew steadier, brighter, until it illuminated every face in the square and burned away the shadows of fear that had ruled them. The soldiers nearest to the general faltered, torn between the man whose orders had once been law and the girl who now stood as proof of an older, stronger law they could not deny, and when one of them dropped his spear with a clatter, the sound rang like a bell of defiance, and others followed, slowly at first, one by one, until the pile of abandoned weapons grew, a heap of steel at her feet that marked the crumbling of his reign, and though some soldiers still held tight to their spears, their eyes darted nervously, for the unity that once bound them was gone, fractured, bleeding away with every heartbeat of the emblem's glow. The general roared at them, cursed them cowards, traitors, vermin, swore that their families would burn, that their bloodlines would be erased, but his threats only revealed his desperation, his voice cracking where once it thundered, his curses falling flat against ears no longer bound by fear, and the people surged closer, pressing forward, not with weapons not yet, but with voices raised high, a wave of humanity that no steel could hold back, and for the first time the soldiers wavered not, because they feared her alone but because they feared the will of the crowd, a force stronger than any army. The girl lifted her hand then, not in command but in acknowledgement, and the emblem blazed like fire across her skin, the intricate lines of the sigil glowing so brightly that even those at the farthest edge of the courtyard could see it, and a hush fell, sudden and complete, for all felt it, a pulse not only of light but of power that reached beyond sight, sinking into bone, a vibration that made hearts stutter and blood race, a command older than words, and in that stillness the general's body convulsed, his forehead pressed hard to the stone as though dragged by invisible chains, and he screamed, not in rage this time but in terror, for he could feel his ancestors pulling at him, dragging his spirit down, demanding obedience he could not give, and the people saw him broken, they saw him powerless, they saw him undone, and their fear dissolved into something fierce, a courage sharpened by years of suffering, a courage that needed only this moment to awaken fully. She did not strike him down, she did not need to, for his downfall was no longer in her hands but in theirs, in the eyes of those who had once trembled before him and now saw only a man defeated, and the chants rose again, louder, clearer, a tide that carried her name and drowned his, and though she remained silent, her heart pounded with the weight of it, the knowledge that the emblem was more than her protection, it was her inheritance, her burden, her destiny, and she felt the truth settle in her bones. This was no accident, no mere chance, this was the hour her bloodline had waited for, and whether she wished it Or not, she was the spark that would set the world alight. The general's desperation boiled into something darker as he realized the crowd was slipping beyond his grasp, and though his body remained shackled by the weight of the emblem's command, his mind clawed frantically for any weapon left to him, any trick, any hidden blade that might shatter this moment before it consumed him entirely, and with a guttural cry he bellowed for his second guard line, men hidden in the shadows of the gates. The ones he trusted above all others, soldiers not chosen for loyalty to crown or coin but for the blood oath they had sworn to him personally, men who would not hesitate no matter what forces they faced, and the heavy creak of iron echoed through the square as gates swung open and armored boots thundered in, a fresh wave of steel-clad warriors surging forward with crossbows raised and blades gleaming, their faces masked in iron to strip away any trace of hesitation, and for a heartbeat the crowd faltered, their cries choking into silence as the line of death advanced, because these were no ordinary soldiers but the general's hounds, trained for slaughter, and the sight of them awakened old fears. Yet before despair could take root the girl lifted her arm higher, the emblem burning with a radiance that outshone the torches, and the new soldiers faltered mid-step, for the mark struck them like a hammer of memory, stirring fragments buried in their blood, whispers of the same ancient oath that bound their master now clawing through their veins, and though they gritted their teeth and tried to force their feet forward, many staggered, some clutching their heads as if 1,000 voices screamed within them, and one dropped his sword with a cry, collapsing to his knees before her without knowing why, as though some unseen hand pressed him down. The general shrieked for them to kill her, his voice raw with panic, but the harder he demanded the more his words splintered, for the emblem's glow was not just a light but a command older than any he could give, a command woven into the very bones of the land, and soldier after soldier faltered, some fighting against themselves, their arms trembling as they aimed their crossbows, bolts quivering in the air, but none loosed, because the strings refused to release, the bows creaked but held fast as though even steel obeyed her emblem and not the man who owned their lives. The people gasped as they saw it, terror transforming into awe once again, and a shout rose from the heart of the crowd, a single voice daring to cry that she was chosen, and once spoken the words ignited others until dozens, then hundreds, cried the same, their voices swelling into thunder that rattled the stones, drowning out the general's curses, and the sound became a wall that pushed back his hounds, making their advance crumble, their lines scatter until they too looked not at their kneeling master but at the barefoot girl whose glow bent the night itself to her will. Rage consumed him then, a rage so venomous it warped his face, and in desperation he thrust his hand toward the sky and screamed an invocation that no mortal tongue should have remembered, calling not upon men or steel but upon the darker pacts his family had kept hidden, and the air trembled with a sickening heat, shadows stretching unnaturally, the torches flickering with black flame as if the night itself answered him, and for the first time the people drew back, for the power he summoned was older and fouler than their chains of fear, a power whispered of in stories meant to frighten children, a pact of blood that gave his line strength at a cost, and the cost was always terrible. The ground cracked beneath him as something unseen surged upward, and his body jerked unnaturally as veins of shadow crawled across his skin, his eyes turning black as pitch, and for a moment it seemed as though he might rise after all, not as man but as monster, his laughter returning in a guttural rasp that curdled the blood of those who heard it, but even then the emblem pulsed stronger, answering his corruption with light so fierce it split the air like thunder, forcing him back to the stone, his body thrashing as the two powers clashed, one of oath and one of betrayal, one of legacy and one of curse, and the square itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of their struggle, dust sifting from the stones as though the city's very bones knew that history was breaking in this moment, that the old world was dying, that a new one was being born in fire and defiance. Under the shadow of the fortress walls, Ilara's heart pounded as the tension in the courtyard thickened, each breath heavy with the scent of dust and iron. The general, once towering with arrogance, now faltered under the unrelenting stare of the hidden emblem pressed against his chest, an ancient seal revealed from within the folds of her gown. The crowd that had once mocked her dignity stood frozen, their jeers silenced, their confidence in the general unraveling thread by thread as they witnessed his trembling hands and paling face. Ilara held the emblem firmly, the glint of its surface catching the torchlight, and her voice carried with a quiet authority that pierced the silence, reminding all present that her worth was not defined by humiliation but by truth and lineage that ran deeper than the general's hollow titles. The soldiers who once restrained her shifted uneasily, casting glances between their leader and the emblem, as though realizing for the first time that they had perhaps stood on the wrong side of history. In that moment the dynamic inverted. No longer was she the disgraced figure dragged into the square, but rather the bearer of a forgotten legacy that demanded reverence. The emblem was more than metal and mark, it was a symbol of the royal bloodline the general had betrayed, and its appearance cracked the mask of invincibility he had worn for years. Murmurs rippled through the gathered townsfolk, whispers of ancient oaths and a kingdom's lost honor resurfacing after years of suppression, while the general's lips parted, but no words came, only the quiver of a man who realized the ground beneath him was collapsing. Ilara stepped forward slowly, each motion deliberate, her presence drawing strength not from vengeance but from the undeniable weight of history now on her side, and with every pace the general retreated as though haunted by the ghosts of promises he had broken long ago. "Do you see now," she said, her tone steady yet charged with emotion, "that no humiliation can strip away what is bound by truth, by the will of those who came before me, and by the light of justice that even you cannot extinguish?" Her words ignited something within the crowd, embers of loyalty that had lain dormant, suppressed by fear, suddenly fanned into flame, and eyes that once looked upon her with pity or disdain now turned to her with awe. The general's knees bent involuntarily, his trembling worsening, not from respect but from terror, for he knew the emblem bore authority recognized even beyond his command, a legitimacy he could not challenge. Memories of how he had clawed his way to power through deception and betrayal surged in his mind, now confronted by the very symbol that exposed him as an impostor. The soldiers began to lower their weapons, their loyalty fractured, and one by one, their expressions shifted from defiance to hesitation, until silence reigned once more, a silence thick with the scent of transformation. Ilara's dignity, once stripped from her, had not only returned but now radiated with a force that redefined her place in the eyes of every witness, and the general, cornered and crumbling, was forced to face the reckoning he had long postponed. Under the torchlight of the Victory Square, silence fell heavy, a silence that carried the weight of judgment and revelation. The general stood frozen, his broad shoulders stiff, his eyes locked on the glowing emblem etched into Ilara's skin, an emblem that had revealed itself when the lash had cut too deeply across her back. It was a mark not of a servant or prisoner, but of a royal bloodline thought to have been extinguished years ago. The symbol shimmered faintly like fire beneath her skin, undeniable and unalterable, the crest of the old dynasty that had once ruled with honor before the general's coup. The soldiers surrounding them shifted uneasily, their faces pale, their loyalty shaken. For years they had believed the general's version of history, that he had saved the nation from corruption, that the royal line had been erased for the sake of progress. Yet here stood a woman, broken and bruised, who bore living proof that the legacy he had claimed to destroy still survived. The crowd that had gathered to witness her humiliation began to murmur, voices carrying disbelief, curiosity, and something else far more dangerous, hope. Ilara struggled to remain standing, her body screaming from the punishment, but within her chest, something fierce awakened. For so long she had carried her lineage in silence, hiding the truth for fear that discovery would bring only death. Yet now, revealed in front of all, she felt strangely unafraid. The general's face had betrayed the one thing he had never wanted to show, fear. He trembled not because of her strength, but because of what her existence meant. She was a living contradiction to his lies, the undoing of the narrative he had built his empire upon. Around them, the soldiers hesitated, their hands twitching on their weapons, torn between the commands drilled into them and the weight of the truth now glowing before their eyes. Ilara lifted her chin, blood trickling down her temple, and with a voice cracked but steady, she spoke the words she had been born to speak. "I am not your enemy," she said. "I am the daughter of those you were told to forget, and I carry their truth in my blood." The square rippled with gasps, the voices of the people swelling louder. The general barked for silence, his voice strained, commanding his soldiers to seize her, but his authority was no longer absolute. A handful obeyed, stepping forward with hesitation, while others held back, their eyes flicking between him and Ilara as though waiting for clarity. Among the civilians, men and women began to kneel, not out of submission to the general but in recognition of the emblem that shone on her body. The old stories had not been fully erased, and whispers of the dynasty's honor had lingered in hearts even under years of oppression. One by one those whispers turned into chants. The rightful blood, the rightful blood. Ilara felt her knees weaken, not from pain this time but from the weight of what was awakening around her. She realized that the general's iron grip had cracked, and from those cracks light poured in. The chants grew louder, defiance breaking into the night, and suddenly the square was no longer his stage of humiliation but hers of revelation. Fury overtook the general, his face twisted in desperation. He lunged forward, blade drawn, intent on ending her before the moment could spread beyond control. But the soldiers closest to Ilara reacted instinctively, not as his pawns but as protectors of something greater than fear. Their weapons clashed with his, the sound ringing out like thunder, and in that instant the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The people surged forward, some trying to shield Ilara with their own bodies, others striking out against the guards who still clung to loyalty. The square erupted into chaos, but within that chaos a truth had rooted itself deeply. She was more than a victim, more than a woman humiliated for spectacle. She was the living emblem of justice denied, and no amount of bloodshed could erase that fact. Amid the struggle, Ilara found herself lifted by hands that trembled not with fear but with reverence. Citizens pulled her away from the worst of the fighting, forming a wall around her as if to declare she belonged to them now, their symbol of defiance. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind blazed with clarity. She saw the general fighting like a beast cornered, his strength formidable but his aura diminished. Each strike he made only deepened the divide between him and those he had ruled through fear. His empire, built on the illusion of control, was crumbling before his eyes. Ilara, clutching her wounded side, realized this was not the end of her pain but the beginning of a much greater battle. Yet for the first time she no longer carried the weight alone. The night stretched on, filled with cries, clashes and the pounding of footsteps, but slowly, inevitably the tide turned. The general's forces broke apart, some fleeing into the shadows, others laying down their arms. At last, surrounded and outnumbered, the once unshakable general fell to his knees, his sword slipping from his hand. He looked at Ilara then, hatred and terror mingling in his eyes, as though her very existence had undone everything he had stolen. But no words could mask his defeat. The people roared with triumph, their voices echoing into the dark sky, a sound of chains breaking and new beginnings stirring. When dawn finally crept over the horizon, Ilara stood weak but unbowed, her body supported by those who now called her their own. The emblem still glowed faintly, a reminder that destiny could be delayed but never erased. She gazed upon the people, their faces alight with hope, and felt both the burden and the honor of what lay ahead. The path would be treacherous, filled with trials and opposition, but the silence that had once bound her was gone. In its place was a chorus of voices that demanded truth and justice, voices that believed in her. She had been stripped of her dignity in public, but in that very moment she had been given something far greater: recognition, purpose, and the power to inspire a fallen nation to rise again. And so, with the general broken and the people awakened, Ilara's journey began anew, not as a servant or a victim, but as the spark of a revolution that no lash, no chain, no lie could extinguish. The end.